This is a summary of Omar Suleiman, Palestine, Gaza, Oct. 7th, Israel, Resistance, Faith, and Islam from the Fridman podcast, where we break down the key insights, ideas, and takeaways from this content, giving you the gist so you can decide if you want the rest. This episode originally aired on the Fridman podcast and is now featured on perfectsummary.com. You can also catch our podcast, Perfect Summary, available everywhere. And subscribe on YouTube at @officialperfectsummary. The discussion explores the historical context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and its deep emotional and spiritual implications, how faith and resistance intertwine within the Muslim and Palestinian experiences of occupation and injustice, practical strategies for seeking justice, understanding trauma, and promoting peace while staying rooted in faith and ethics, setting the emotional and historical stage. Dr. Omar Suleiman begins with a heart-wrenching reflection on his personal connection to the pain of Palestinians. He speaks about the difficulty of remaining composed in the face of immense suffering, especially after the events of October 7th. For many Palestinians, including Suleiman, the violence is not a singular moment, but part of a long and ongoing trauma shaped by decades of displacement, oppression, and resistance. He recalls walking through Gaza and East Jerusalem, witnessing the resilience of a people under siege, and feeling a mix of hope and heartbreak. For Suleiman, this isn't an academic conversation. It's a visceral lived experience shaped by family, history, and religious duty. Deep dive into main ideas. A lifetime of dehumanization and displacement. Suleiman addresses the deep historical trauma experienced by Palestinians, especially those in Gaza and the West Bank. He stresses that Palestinian suffering isn't a post-October 7 reality. It's been ongoing for over 75 years. The Nakba, catastrophe of 1948, isn't a distant event, but an open wound, a generational trauma passed from grandparents to children. The repeated displacement, statelessness, and daily humiliation have created what he calls a collective PTSD. And this context is often erased in Western narratives that frame October 7th as the beginning of violence. He also contrasts how Palestinian civilians are depicted in Western media versus Israeli civilians, highlighting how Palestinians are often stripped of their humanity. The moral dissonance of selective grief. One of Suleiman's most powerful arguments centers on grief and moral consistency. He expresses deep pain for the lives lost in Israel on October 7th, particularly those of children and civilians. However, he's critical of how global outrage was swift and absolute for Israeli lives, but muted or absent when it came to Palestinian suffering. This selective grief, he argues, exposes a dehumanization that is baked into how Palestinians are perceived. It allows for the normalization of violence against them and the framing of Palestinian resistance as inherently illegitimate, regardless of the form it takes. Islam, resistance, and ethics. Suleiman discusses the theological and ethical boundaries of resistance in Islam. He is clear: targeting civilians, whether Israeli or Palestinian, is unequivocally wrong and has no justification in the faith. He speaks about the need for moral clarity and cautions against allowing trauma to justify the unjustifiable. At the same time, he emphasizes that Islam honors the right to resist oppression. Drawing parallels to the Prophet Muhammad's experience in Mecca and Medina, he argues that resisting tyranny is not just permitted, it's spiritually essential, but it must be done ethically, without sacrificing the very principles one seeks to defend. The hypocrisy of political and religious institutions. Suleiman critiques the political and religious establishments in the West, particularly in the U.S., for their silence or complicity. He's especially pained by the betrayal of Christian and Muslim leaders who, in the name of neutrality or diplomacy, fail to call out atrocities. He also challenges the role of American foreign policy in perpetuating the cycle of violence. Billions of dollars in aid, he notes, go to fund the military apparatus used to oppress Palestinians. Meanwhile, peaceful protest or solidarity with Palestinians is criminalized or labeled anti-Semitic. Trauma and the struggle for empathy. The conversation delves into the psychological toll of the conflict. Suleiman speaks about the trauma that both Palestinians and Israelis carry. He stresses the need for empathy and truth-telling, acknowledging that healing requires honest confrontation with history, not denial or revisionism. He believes that true peace is only possible when both people's suffering is fully recognized and when power dynamics are corrected, not just symbolically, but structurally. Hackstosh approachable research insights and real-world reflections. Faith and prophetic ethics. Suleiman repeatedly returns to the example of the Prophet Muhammad as a model for navigating injustice with integrity. The Prophet, despite being persecuted, never dehumanized his oppressors. Suleiman sees this as a guidepost for modern resistance. Media narratives and propaganda. He explains how the framing of Palestinian stories in Western media shapes public opinion. Palestinians are often presented as aggressors even when they are victims, reinforcing harmful stereotypes and justifying disproportionate violence. Calls for boycott and sanctions. Suleiman supports nonviolent resistance, such as BDS, as a moral and strategic approach. He sees it as a necessary counterbalance to an imbalance of power and a means of pushing for accountability without bloodshed. Conclusion. Justice as a prerequisite for peace. Omar Suleiman's message is clear. Peace without justice is impossible. Any conversation that seeks to resolve the conflict without addressing the root causes, occupation, apartheid, and systemic dehumanization, will fail. He ends with a call for courage. For people of faith, especially Muslims and Christians, he urges a return to the moral clarity of their teachings. Silence in the face of injustice is not neutrality, it's complicity. He reminds listeners that justice isn't a political slogan, it's a divine imperative. That's a wrap on Omar Suleiman, Palestine, Gaza, Oct 7th, Israel, Resistance, Faith, and Islam. If you found this summary valuable, make sure to follow, subscribe, and come back for more in-depth breakdowns of content. Visit perfectsummary.com, check out the Perfect Summary podcast everywhere you listen, and follow our YouTube channel at @officialperfectsummary.